Hello, my name is Barbara Figge Fox, and I'm here to tell you about the hobby of collecting buttons. Every button has a story. We're going to learn about stories that buttons tell. Some of the stories are about who collects them. Many of us have a jar of buttons somewhere, maybe from our mother or grandmother. Some of us are quilters, using buttons to embellish the work. Some like to craft with buttons or make things with them. Others are sewers, using beautiful buttons to make our outfits look better. And some of us just like nice old things because, after all, buttons are the world's smallest antique. So here we go. Every button has a story. What story do your buttons tell? And just so you know, this little girl is the grandchild of a neighbor in Hopewell. And we did get permission to use her picture. Who collects these buttons? Well, these are the folks who might have buttons in a jar left over from outfits, or the quilters. This is what they call a crazy quilt, embellished with beautiful buttons. Examples of craft. You can take ordinary buttons and use them to make things. We button collectors do ask that you don't cut the shanks off. Don't make them unbuttons. So the sew-through buttons are better for pasting on crafts. And here somebody has made a beautiful work of art on a piece of fabric, clothing art. This beautiful button was on an outfit worn by Shirley MacLaine in Downton Abbey. A button collector who was artistic made this design of a crown and then put paste or rhinestone buttons on it. Which makes a lovely piece to hang on the wall or give to somebody who's queen for the day, right? And these are just buttons that are hard to resist. Who can resist Teddy Roosevelt or a cat made from buttonwood? Boxwood, not buttonwood, boxwood, sorry. So many times people ask, well, how did you get started collecting buttons? And I'm very fortunate to have inherited my grandmother's button collection, who began buying buttons in the early 1940s when it was a very new hobby. The New Jersey State Button Society is 79 years old. And button collecting wasn't a formal hobby like stamp and coin collecting until 1939, 1940s. So my grandmother was a Victorian lady who wore a corset every day of her life. And she was, of course, not in the middle-class white woman, was not in the workplace. And this was her devotion. When my sister and I were young, we used to like to polish her buttons. We would help her. We would take the buttons and polish them on a rough rug, and then on a smooth rug, and then with a little brush, and then with soft cloths. We had a regular routine. So when I work with my buttons, it reminds me of my grandmother. And I think if you have buttons from your mother or grandmother, you will it will give you that satisfaction too. So here are the kinds of buttons that she collected. This was a button tray of all dogs, and these were made in the 19th century. And they are indeed gorgeous. In another program, I'll tell you about how metal buttons were made. So those are stories of who collects them. I now, as president of the New Jersey State Button Society, I go around giving talks. And this outfit on the left is a Pearly costume. Pearlies were like the mummers of Philadelphia. They would get these gorgeous outfits, all encrusted with pearl buttons. And then they would make charity appearances. I was fortunate enough to be able to get a hold of This was made for somebody else. With the New Jersey State Button Society, like many of us, I compete with trays and we have shows and judges, but mostly we just have fun looking at buttons. And one of the reasons why we really like buttons is because there's really something amazing, something charming in seeing the smallest things done so thoroughly, as if to remind the careless that whatever is worth doing at all is worth doing well. So the stories are about those who collect, and you can find your own stories about the collection that you have. Also about who wears them. Now, it will come as no surprise to women to discover that until the Industrial Revolution, middle-class women could not afford these beautiful buttons. It was men who were the peacocks until machines came along, except for the Duchess in the painting on the right, who has these beautiful enamel buttons. Men were the peacocks. Gold buttons were the rage at Versailles, and Francis I supposedly had 34,000 of them on one tunic. If a man had a gambling debt, he could clip off a gold button and hand it over. So collecting stories, wearing stories, and then another kind of story is about how buttons were made, from what material they were made. Now there are 48 different kinds of materials. You can see some of them here. This is button eye candy. The one I'm going to tell you about now is about shell buttons. And what I think of when I look at a shell button is where it came from, the danger that somebody had to go to get it, and the fact that it was once a living thing. It was the home of a living mollusk that created that shell. These are some of the kinds of shell buttons that you can admire and collect. Charles Dickens described the agony and the difficulty of finding these shells to be made into buttons. This is a picture of Aborigines off the coast of Australia here with pressure suits, but before they had pressure suits, they dove without them. Then there was the plunge and the wrenching of the shells from the rocks and putting them into the pouch at the waist, and the ascent amidst a vast pressure of water, causing the head to seethe and roar and the ears to ache and the imprisoned breath to convulse the frame. And then there was the fear of sharks. It was 1852, Charles Dickens. But some of the shell buttons are just gorgeously, beautifully crafted, but even the very simple ones make me in awe of how at one time this shell came from a living thing. And you can see the bark of that, the brown part of that shell. Each of the white surfaces, if you turn it over in this group of buttons, there would be a brown surface on the other side, because that was the outside of the shell, and you can tell that they came from the sea. Dickens describes it: the rainbow light which gleams from the surface seems to show to us the picture of where this shell once was and what was done about it. In contrast is this beautiful 18th century shell button, carved so gorgeously. And another which has a center of painted, I believe that's ivory, and a metal encircled by metal, and then the shell is the white part, and different bands are interspliced. These are 20th century painted shell buttons by an artist named Brooks. So yes, each button has a story about who wore it, who collected it, who made it. But how does that affect the person who doesn't have a collection, who's just starting to collect? Because how do you get into this anyway? Well, one way to do it is to decide, I'm just going to collect one subject. Now, somebody I know found an angel button among her collection, and so she's now collecting more angel buttons. Another person I know collects only heart buttons. You can also decide to collect just one material, one kind of button. So let me show you how that would work. You can choose to collect just only vintage buttons of a certain century, or only uniform buttons. Men sometimes like to do this, or veterans. There's a whole lore of work clothes buttons or uniform buttons. Or maybe you just like to go to the fabric shops and pick out pretty buttons, and that's fine. You can collect those that are made in the past 5 years. Or there are artists who specialize in making buttons, and you can patronize them and ask them to make you a special one. Here is an example of collecting one subject, say winged insects in different materials. The left is a studio button. Here you might decide to collect plastics, especially celluloid. Now, celluloid was the very first material made, and I'm going to turn off this screen and look deep into your eyes and say, if you have buttons in a jar or a tin, if there's a celluloid button in there and you open it, it will smell of formaldehyde, and likely it is ruining the other buttons in that jar or tin. So as soon as I finish, go find that jar or tin, open it up, put it in a box or punch holes in it or something, because you don't want that to happen to your buttons. Celluloid buttons are nice, but they're a little risky. In this picture is also some celluloid wafers. A friend of mine collects only celluloid wafers, and she's made them into a necklace that she entered into one of our contests. You can also decide to collect these fun, realistic buttons made to look like what they are, and we call them goofies. They were very popular during the war and in the 30s when plastics were just getting started, and you can imagine them as children's buttons on children's outfits. Here are some art goofies of different fruits. So what do you do when you get them? What do you do with them? Well, many like to mount them on beautiful cards, to hang on the walls and enjoy the beauty and be able to enjoy passing by and seeing the beauty of these individual buttons. But you might also want to compete with them. And so your focus in mounting them would be to make it clear that you are meeting the requirements for the competition with labels. So this innovative button collector, her name is Marcy Kagan. She had a collection of buttons that featured people's heads, everything from Fred Flintstone down here to a Victorian lady up here. And so she created a family wall that was kind of fun. You could also take a holiday as a theme. There's only 2 or 3 buttons on this card that it costs more than 50 cents, but it's a lovely card to be able to hang up on your wall, your entrance porch for a particular holiday, or to give away as a present. For instance, if you were going to do a Christmas card, all these buttons about Santa Claus could be had on Etsy. I would caution about buying expensive vintage buttons on Etsy or eBay, though, because you can't tell whether the person is giving you a good deal or not. some people use buttons to create jewelry. And again, we ask that you don't take the shanks off. Try to keep the button as it is, because that's just the ethic of button collecting. And buttons can take you down the rabbit hole of history. This card, as I was putting this program together, I looked at the address on it, and the person who was wholesaling these buttons to area stores has the address of Belle Meade, which is my neighborhood. So I'm looking forward to finding out more about that business. My favorite way of enjoying my buttons is to use them as gifts. Say you know somebody who rides horses or grows iris, or favorite animal is a turtle. So your turtle collector has every possible turtle figurine, but they don't have a turtle button. So you find a beautiful one, you put it in a little frame, and it makes a beautiful gift. Because there is surely something charming in seeing the smallest things done so thoroughly, as if to remind the careless that what is worth doing at all is worth doing well. I've really enjoyed talking to you today. We have more programs. The next one will probably be on metal buttons and how they were made. That's a fascinating story of Birmingham, England. To find out more, there is the website NewJerseyStateButtonSociety.com or buttonsinnewjersey@gmail.com. And there's a national site and a Facebook page. Buttoncountry.com is a good place to go, just to ogle and see all the beautiful buttons. So welcome to the world of collecting, and let us in the New Jersey State Button Society tell us your story of collecting buttons. Thanks for being with us.